When he had come to Jerusalem, he attempted to join the disciples, and they were all afraid of him, for they did not believe that he was a disciple. And by the end of the book of Acts, James the Just is still trying to help save Paul from the other disciples of Jesus. In that case, however, it's the observant Pharisaic disciples whose accusations were given, namely, teaching Jews living among Gentiles to forsake Moses, not to circumcise their children, and not to observe the customs. Though the fight between Paul and the Jewish Christians is the most infamous battle in the New Testament, the Jewish Christians were actually Paul's later adversaries. Paul's first opponents in the movement were the Hellenist disciples. He spoke and argued with the Hellenists, but they were attempting to kill him. The Hellenists were those disciples whose ideas and their identities were Greek, not their ethnicities, or not just their ethnicities. These disciples were the students of philosophy and reason, and they were the first ones to see through Paul's gospel to the Gentiles. In their own way, the Hellenist disciples were the first Protestants. Not only was Paul responsible for the murder of one of their own, Saint Stephen, but the Hellenists were uniquely aware of the falsehoods of Paul's gospel, since Paul was attempting to tread on their territory of Greek philosophy. Unlike the actual students of philosophy, like the Hellenist disciples, Paul was simply trying to appeal to philosophy in order to try to evangelize his new religion. It's comparable to how religious debates used to center around arguing for the general existence of a god, and then having the religious apologists swap their religion's god in for that general philosophical god. The Hellenist disciples were having none of that, however. Greek philosophy wasn't something cheap, frivolous, and meaningless that it could be twisted into validating religious belief. The Hellenists were the first to protest how Paul utterly missed the point. In their case, how Paul utterly missed the point of Greek philosophy. What the Hellenist disciples were reacting to was how Paul's gospel really was a gospel for the Gentiles, appealing within philosophy and within Hellenistic thought to try to argue in favor of a belief in God. However, what the Jewish Christians were reacting to were the later evolutions of Paul's gospel, when it had evolved to exclude observant and faithful Jews, all for not believing in Jesus. The Hellenists saw Paul for who and what he was, and they weren't playing along. Paul had just assassinated their leader, Saint Stephen, when Saint Stephen had outmatched his opponents in debates. But more than this, the Hellenist leader, Saint Stephen, was targeted by Paul because of the role that Saint Stephen already occupied within the Jesus movement. Paul's motivation for murdering Saint Stephen premeditated, and it had everything to do with Paul's infiltration of the Jesus movement. Saint Stephen needed to go in order for Paul to be able to conduct his plan to infiltrate and take down the Jesus movement, and Paul acted on behalf of hostile powers, the first of which was the Herodian family, to which I believe Paul belonged through his father's marriage. The second, the Sadducee high priest family of Hanan, Ananias, or Anan, and the third and most significant is the Romans, from the proconsul of Cyprus to the Corinth. Of course, it should be emphasized that to work for any of these would be to work in the interest of all the others. But even with that, Paul has direct connections to all of them. The easiest of these connections to establish is the one that the book of Acts establishes. That is, Paul's connection to the chief priests.
And this is what I did in Jerusalem with the authority I received from the high priests.
Paul's most revealing connection, however, is his connection to the Herodians, and the evidence for this connection is quite extensive. In Romans, Paul greets somebody named Herodian, whom he calls his relative or his compatriot. And he also greets, in Romans, those of the house of Aristobulus, a Herodian family. In Acts, it's made clear that one of the members of the early church in Antioch was a member of Herod's court, named Manaen. Paul's most illustrative Herodian connection comes from his boasting in 2 Corinthians when he discusses how he was lowered in a basket to escape the forces of King Aretas of Nabatea.
I'm not afraid of your power on earth, Herod Antipas!
King Aretas had a falling out with the Herodians because Herod Antipas dishonored King Aretas' daughter in order to marry his brother's wife. John the Baptist's stance on the issue demonstrated that he was Herod's opponent politically, not just religiously for violations of the Torah. Tensions eventually exploded, and King Aretas invaded Galilee in pursuit of the Herodians. And around the year 36, King Aretas or his forces were in Damascus. It must be emphasized, Paul would not have been hunted by King Aretas unless he had Herodian connections. Paul's Herodian connections demonstrate that there was a flow of information passing from Paul to the Herodian ruling family, and that this flow of information happened even while Paul was claiming to be an apostle. This information led directly to the arrest and the assassination of the apostle James, son of Zebedee. This makes the apostle James, son of Zebedee, the second major figure of early Christianity to be murdered as the direct result of Paul's involvement. Paul's falling out with the disciples is best demonstrated by following and reconstructing Paul's third missionary journey. And while Paul does travel through the interior regions, Paul's third missionary journey really begins in Ephesus. In Ephesus, Paul experiences the pinnacle of his career as an apostle. He's accepted as an apostle and nobody questions his authority. According to the book of Acts, Paul encounters 12 disciples in Ephesus who not only accept Paul as an apostle, but they get rebaptized as full Pauline believers. These disciples are the ones that I hold were the original authors of the Gospel of Mark, or the origin of the announcement. Despite how scholars assert that it has to be post-70 after the destruction of the temple, I believe that the Gospel of Mark was originally composed to conform within Paul's Gospel, and it was meant to allow for Paul's special place for himself after Jesus' death. The Gospel of Mark's frequent use of Paul's term, gospel, in addition to its negative depiction of the original apostles and disciples, as well as the distancing of Jesus from his own family, it was all done out of consideration for Paul and his gospel. It's in Ephesus that I believe that Paul started writing down his Gospel to the Gentiles, and it took the form of the Epistle to the Romans. Paul didn't want his gospel of grace through faith to be forgotten nor misunderstood, and he wanted there to be a direct access to his more complete arguments, more than what he'd previously dedicated to writing. Paul needed something that could compete with or augment the Gospel of Mark. And I believe that some form of the Gospel of Mark was already in Rome, at least by the time that Paul was writing Romans. Paul left Ephesus with a plan to address the growing questions about his authority, and that plan was the collection. Paul departed with the intention of collecting enough money that the Jerusalem community couldn't say no, and when, or rather if, they accepted it, then Paul could use the gesture to claim solidarity with the original disciples, as well as claim their endorsement for his gospel of grace through faith. However, by the time that Paul would come to return to Ephesus, he'd lack the credibility as a disciple or believer in Jesus to even be able to step foot in the city. Paul made his way to Macedonia, according to the book of Acts, before staying in Greece for 3 months. It's during these 3 fateful months that I believe that Paul had a falling out with the Jewish Christians, the ones who'd previously been quoted as saying, "We belong with Cephas." Though the book of Acts simply says, "the Jews," I, like Chaim Maccabee, hold that the book of Acts is employing a bit of code. The references to the Jews of Asia, for instance, were actually references to Jewish Christians, who would have been a bit more aware of what Paul was teaching. No greater support for this thesis exists other than the fact that the Jewish Christian criticisms of Paul, as relayed by James the Just, were pretty much the same criticisms that the Jews of Asia had as well. I really don't think it's any great coincidence that, about the time that Paul finishes Romans and fully articulates its ideas, that Paul would have a falling out with the Jewish Christians. The Jewish Christians would have opposed Paul's conclusions in the Epistle of Romans just as much as the mainstream Orthodox Pharisaic Jews. Between Paul's epistles, like Romans and 1st and 2nd Corinthians, it's also clear that the accusations made against Paul, in the book of Acts by Jews and/or / Jewish Christians were completely 100% accurate. The Epistle of Romans wasn't just a way for Paul to reach out to a community he'd never visited before. The Epistle of Romans became Paul's way to cut ties with his current communities, the Jewish community and the Jesus movement. Well, it's highly speculative. There is another reason why the Jews and Jewish Christians would have been so upset with Paul, prompting Paul to change his plans. In order for this to be a possibility, all we have to do is move up the death of another prominent figure by 2 years, and that figure is Andrew, Peter's brother and Hellenistic apostle. If the date of Andrew's traditional death is moved up by just 2 years, then this puts Andrew in the same areas of Greece as Paul, as well as at the same time as Paul, about the same time that Paul had a falling out with the Jewish disciples. Andrew's crucifixion in Patras, even with its original date, even without Paul's involvement, still demonstrates how the disciples of Jesus were treated poorly in areas under Paul's influence, just as Paul was treated poorly in those areas where the disciples of Jesus were otherwise treated as another sect of Pharisee Jews. When Paul goes into the territory of the original disciples, he needs to be rescued by the Romans. When an apostle like Andrew goes into the territory where the disciples of Paul live in peace, Andrew gets crucified by the Romans. Either way, this incident was a turning point for Paul and the disciples of Jesus. From here on out, Paul becomes openly hostile toward the disciples of Jesus. From this point onward, Paul ceases to simply announce his gospel to the Gentiles, or announce his gospel of grace through faith for all mankind, and Paul shifts his focus to defending himself from attacks from the other disciples of Jesus. When observing Paul's travels on a map, it becomes clear that Paul was retreating. Paul was a man on the run from the Jewish Christian disciples of Jesus. Once back in Macedonia, Paul writes 2 Corinthians chapters 10 through 13, and it's worth noting that at this point, Paul still plans to return to Corinth a third time. It's also worth noting that Paul's criticisms are directed toward the other disciples of Jesus. They're not directed toward non-believing Jews. In the process of having messengers return with money and reply letters, Paul decides not to return to Corinth, and he sends 2 Corinthians chapters 1 through 9 with messengers to get more money. Every time that Paul changes his plans, like when he decided not to set sail to the Holy Land from Greece, it's clear that he does so because he's avoiding conflict and confessing guilt. From his decision not to return to Ephesus, I believe that it's also clear that Paul is trying to mask his movements as much as he can from the disciples of Jesus. But before getting to the point of deciding not to return to Ephesus, Paul made a mysterious choice, one that I believe places him at the scene of another murder. In the book of Revelation, a mysterious martyr is mentioned named Antipas, whose martyrdom was a past but apparently infamous event. Antipas, as well as the reference to Balaam, are clearly code. Balaam as a reference to Paul is the easiest to decode, but Antipas has always been different. The key to encoding it came from an Ebionite Jewish Christian text, the Clementine Homilies, and in this text it identifies Apollos with Mithras, at least in the eyes of the Jewish Christians. This is important because Antipas was a title of someone initiated into the cult of Mithras. Hence, in the eyes of the Jewish Christians, Apollos and Antipas were connected. So at least in Jewish Christian code, Apollos was the Antipas of Revelation chapter 2. After spending 7 days in Troas, Paul made a mysterious and otherwise unexplained decision. Paul has the rest of his followers go on by boat without him, all while he goes on foot to Assos. The book of Acts is also clear that Paul is the one who made this arrangement for them. It was all part of his plan. However, in doing so, what Paul lacks for himself is an alibi, from Troas to Assos. It's in this gap in Paul's travelogue that Paul had the time and opportunity to go to Pergamum. It's in Pergamum that Paul added another disciple of Jesus to his list of disciples that he was responsible for killing. This time it was Apollos. codenamed Antipas, Paul's Hellenistic and rationalistic rival within the movement. Paul made mention of the danger he felt he faced from false brothers, but it would seem that it was these so-called false brothers who were the ones who were actually in danger from Paul. In his speech to the Ephesian believers in Miletus, Paul tries to defame and discredit the accusations of the Jewish Christians, whom he calls savage wolves who distort the truth. After this, Paul makes it to Jerusalem. But despite his stealthy efforts, James the Just warned Paul that the Jewish Christians will certainly hear that you have come. James the Just is clearly acknowledging that the Jewish Christians pose a substantial threat to Paul, and that his concern demonstrated the Jewish Christians had it out for Paul. In a subtle act of defiance, James the Just refuses Paul's collection money, and he instead has Paul finance an open participation in the sacrificial system. The collection was supposed to be a way for Paul to get an endorsement for him and his gospel of grace through faith, but the only thing the collection ended up endorsing was the sacrificial system of the Torah. If you want to explore more of how Paul was a false apostle sent in to infiltrate and take down the Jesus movement, then I couldn't recommend my book enough.
Yeah, you know what?